And good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to thank, first of all, the ICT for the invitation to speak. If we can get the slides up.
This one?
No. Can I use this? I'm going to talk about a topic that worries a lot of Western governments at the moment, namely the prospects of a terrorism spillover from Syria. But of course, I have not come here to tell you that there are lots of jihadis in Syria and that you should be afraid, because there are already over 1,000 news articles that do that. What I want to do is go a little bit further and offer a structured assessment of how many of the foreign fighters in Syria are likely to go on and perpetrate attacks in the West. I'll present some data from past conflicts. I'll look for things that may explain why some conflicts produced more spillover than others, and what we can infer from this for the Syrian case. My conclusion is going to be that we basically have no way of knowing what the return rate will be, but there is one crucial variable to follow closely, and that is whether or not the organizations in the theater adopt a strategy of systematically targeting the West. And so far, there is no such organization in Syria, but it may change. So my analysis starts with two basic assumptions. The first one is that not every foreign fighter becomes an international terrorist. Far from it. As I showed in my article in the APSR earlier this year, historically, at most 1 in 9 of the Westerners who went to fight in conflicts like Afghanistan and Iraq have come home to perpetrate terrorist attacks. The second assumption is that the return rate varies between conflicts. Some places, like Iraq, had a lot of foreign fighters, but almost none of whom ended up attacking in the West. Others, places like Yemen or Afghanistan, like Yemen, have had few foreign fighters, but instead, most of them have gone on to participate in plots. So this means that we cannot take the 1 in 9 estimate and apply it flatly to Syria. The rate from Syria could be higher, but it could also be much lower. So the key question then becomes, what are the features that make some destinations produce many returnees, and does Syria possess those features? We could, of course, ask, before I move on, does it make a difference? Does it matter whether the return rate is 1 in 5 or 1 in 50, when the total number of foreign fighters in Syria, we're talking about around 5,000 people, it's so large that even a 1 in 50 rate would mean several serious plots. Here I would say that I think it matters greatly because it has implications for how we deal with the jihadi enclave in northeastern Syria after Assad falls. Can we deal with it Somalia style, meaning with light pressure, or will we have to deal with it AFPAC style, with heavy pressure? And if we need to do the latter, then we need to start thinking as soon as possible about how it can be done and what the implications may be. I have to stress also that I'm focusing here on the spillover effect in the West. The foreign fighters in Syria will cause all kinds of problems domestically and regionally, but these challenges are so numerous and so complex that they require a whole different inquiry. So let me start by giving you my best estimate of return rate from past conflicts. The numbers you see in the two left columns are from the data set that I built for the APSR article. And you can look at the article for the details on how the data set was constructed. But you need to, here, for now, you need to know a few things. That one, it's based on open sources, basically aggregated press reports. Secondly, that it contains the 106 most serious plots, not just executed attacks, but plots as well, carried out in the West between 1990 and 2010. And third, that it contains 401 individuals identified as the main participants in these plots, along with their documented travel histories. So travel history is documented in open sources. And the numbers in the third column are my estimates, also based on aggregated open sources. And it's a slightly modified version of the list I provided in my article on foreign fighters in international security a few years ago. I don't need to tell you that this type of quantification is very problematic and that this is an inexact science. And there are lots of things to debate here. But I would say that even if all the numbers are slightly wrong, I think we can still glean some broad patterns from the data. And if the numbers are completely wrong, then hopefully you can still use the framework, the procedure that I'm using here. So what are the patterns we can glean? Well, two major ones. The first is that the vast majority of plots in the West that involved foreign fighters, in those cases, the people in question had been to Afghanistan in the late 1990s or in AFPAC after 9/11. So the foreign fighter factor in Western jihadism is largely an AFPAC phenomenon. It's also worth noting that some conflicts where we expected a large spillover, Iraq, for example, we've had very little, surprisingly little spillover. The second pattern is that when you factor in the gross supply of foreign fighters and get the rates to the far right there, then the destinations fall into two, perhaps three classes. I don't care about the specific, I don't care whether it's 1 in 22 or 1 in 25. It's the orders of magnitude here that matter. And there's two basic classes, the high rate destinations, Afghanistan pre and post 9/11, and Yemen. And then the low rate destinations like Afghanistan in the 80s, Iraq, or Bosnia. So how do we make sense of this? Why is it that we see this variation? Now, I don't have a good answer, but I will consider a few hypotheses that sometimes feature in analyses about the spillover threat. And there may be many other hypotheses we can look at, but I've chosen these four ones that you see in the table here. So first, the Western military presence. One might suggest that conflicts where the U.S. is heavily militarily invested are likely to produce more spillover because the people the foreign fighters in theater get angrier with the Western troops there. But as you can see here, there's no clear pattern. Iraq had big Western presence and little spillover. Yemen doesn't have a big military presence and has a high return rate. What about geographic proximity to Europe? One might suggest that conflicts that are closer to the West produce more spillover because it's practically easier to go there and attack. And I don't see any clear pattern there either. A third suggestion would be to say that it matters whether you have an Al-Qaeda group there. So or whether you have an Al-Qaeda itself or an Al-Qaeda affiliate on the ground. And interestingly, this doesn't really account for the variation either. I would say you have it in the three high-rate countries, destinations, but you also have them in other areas that have low return rates. So far in my thinking about this issue, I've only been able to identify one factor that plausibly accounts for the variation, or for some of the variation, and that is whether or not there is an organization present in the theater that has a declared strategy of systematically targeting the West. That is what you have in AFPAC, that is what you have in Yemen, but you don't have it in the other theaters. And this factor presumably drives the high return rate through two mechanisms. One is the obvious one, that they're sending people back because that's what they want to do. But the other mechanism is a selection effect, that the places that have such organizations on the ground attract more of those foreign fighters that are open to attacking the West in the first place. So they get sort of slightly more radical recruits. That's probably true with AFPAC, certainly today, and I think it's also true of Yemen. So what does this mean for Syria? Well, if we look at this table that I jotted down, there's no Western military presence or involvement yet. It may be days away. But even if we get strikes, the boots on the ground are unlikely in the foreseeable future. It's relatively near Europe, and we have several Al-Qaeda affiliates present. But we do not have an organization with a declared strategy of targeting the West. And let me stress here that I'm not suggesting that the jihadi groups in Syria are not anti-Western. Of course they are, but they don't have a declared strategy of systematically targeting the West. There's lots of anti-Westernism in the discourse, but they're not saying we are now going to kill you on your territory, in the way that Al-Qaeda core and Al-Qaeda in Yemen are. So basically, I think much hinges on this square in the bottom right corner here, whether or not we will get an organization in Syria that adopts such a strategy. So I'll conclude with basically three bottom lines here. One is that return rates vary widely between destinations, and it's difficult to extrapolate from past data. The second is that it is difficult to identify determinants of this variation. So it's very difficult to predict whether Syria will produce high or low rates. And as I said, and this is the third bottom line, the only reliable indicator that we can work with, I think, is the declared intentions of the groups on the ground. So a couple of policy implications here. The first one follows from the last conclusion, and is that we need to monitor very, very closely what these groups are saying to the world and to them, between themselves. We need to, watch very carefully for any early signs of, adoption of, a strategy of attacking in the West. We need to find out what they want. And another important policy implication here is that in the absence of other kind of good indicators, the main thing we can do is to track the flows of foreign fighters. Get the names of the people who go there, get their identities and as much information as we can, and keep it for the future. And I don't know. I'm not in the intel world, so I don't know how much is being done already. But presumably, we're working with Turkey and Lebanon and Jordan to do this. If we're not, start immediately, so that we don't do the same mistake as we did in the late 90s, and not keep track of these people. So I'll end just by saying that we know one thing, which is that the absolute number of foreign fighters in Syria is so large now that there will almost certainly be plots. Even with a low rate, there will be several attacks in the West, and I think the chances of zero spillover from Syria in Europe are extremely slim. So on that cheerful note, I'll end my remarks. Thank you.